I must say you're quite different from what I expected.
Oh, but Cecilia, she's exactly what I told you she'd be. Well, how do you like Mandela?
Very beautiful, isn't it?
And how do you get along with Mrs. Danvers?
Well, I've never met anyone quite like her before.
You mean she scares you? She's not exactly an oil painting, is she?
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. So today I'm joined by Tariq Fancy, who is a founder and CEO of the Rumie initiative. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So without mentioning the company that you were with previously, you were the chief investment officer for sustainable investing at a $9 trillion asset management company. If you could kind of share a little bit more around, the role that you had and why and how that started to kind of, kind of shape your thoughts and perspective around what is, sustainable and green investing, right? Or the various terminologies that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the idea generally behind sustainable investing, it's hard. There's a lot of words that people talk about, but in general, there's this idea of sustainable investing, impact investing, responsible, ethical investing. They all mean slightly different things, but generally the idea is that as you make an investment alongside the traditional search for return or yield, you're also measurably moving the needle on some sort of environmental or social outcome, right? And so that's almost, you could say this is theoretically a double bottom line. And so in my role doing sustainable investing, there was the goal of looking at all of our investment processes that cost the $9 trillion of, really it's a microcosm of capitalism, and looking at how we can better integrate environmental and social considerations into the processes through which we invest, as well as creating a new category of impact products that are a subset that, generally speaking, have the goal of advancing some sort of environmental and social goals. And I ended up in that role because I had a unique background of both being an investor as an investment banker, but then for a long time, an investor who built strategies. And so I knew different asset classes. I knew how to build and hire investors and run programs. I also, in the few years before I went there, had left to create a digital tech nonprofit that I've now turned my focus back to Rumie, as you mentioned. And so it was sort of this idea of like, I understood both bottom lines as a trained investor, had done the social bottom lines. And the goal really was, merging the two, right? In a way that creates both financial and social outcomes.
So I think out of fairness, I wonder if we can look at this from the perspective of not a point in time, but a continuum. So, perhaps maybe at the time that you were in that capacity, certainly, was there some greenwashing, perhaps, and was there negative ESG filtering, perhaps? But, with the likes of the World Bank and IFC and the operating principles and various other standards and frameworks that are out there, that's moving towards more, let's say, forensics or accounting, and certainly accountability around performance. I wonder if things are changing. So when you give your perspective, is it a point in time perspective, or is it taking into consideration the change on the continuum of the maturity that it's progressing?
It's really the change, right? I think if you look at it at a point in time, you see a set of ideas that are interesting and they seem like they're moving in the right direction. If you look at it over time, you start to realize that the actions that are taking place are nowhere near adequate enough to move the needle on the social issues that we need to move. And the reason starts to become clear. It's because, frankly, we're not using the right levers, right? The right lever, if you want to reduce, the way you think, having worked on Wall Street all these years and sitting at this massive firm looking at it, the one thing I can tell you with confidence is that Wall Street will always chase the best profits and the best yield. Now, I don't say that in a disparaging way. I say it as in a realistic way. And there's a reason it's realistic. It's because the system is built to work like that through a series of legal and financial legal obligations, in particular, the fiduciary duty, where there's a chain of interactions where people have to focus on dollar values, not social values or anything else. It has to be either legally constrained because it's not their money, and financial incentives where they're paid based on the return of dollar values. That creates a straitjacket in the system where if you have a market failure, so for example, people are burning fossil fuels and not paying the costs of the pollution that they're creating. Those costs are clear for society. They're just going to be paid someday by, the youngest and the poorest, frankly, when we've wasted sort of the carbon budget, so to speak. But the challenge is the system right now, the money goes exactly where you expect it to. It's the most profitable things. And I think that as I looked at it from the inside, I realized over time that the rate of change with these small sort of incremental changes that are being done are nowhere near the level of systemic change we need to address these problems.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree with you more on that point. I think, if you think about this notion of, kind of this negative filtering, right? So we're not going to include in this particular fund or, account, manage accounts, for example, of these types of players because it's tobacco, it's oil and gas, whatnot. But the reality is, the largest backers, financiers of let's call it the oil and gas are the big banks. The big banks, every one of them have actually participated in the upstream, midstream, and downstream plays and have, to your point, handsomely profited. The other aspect is on the impact productization. Yes, there's a lot of green bonds and exciting things happening, ESG bonds and so forth. But at the same time, it's a very small subset of the total universe of products that are out there, correct?
That's absolutely right. The challenge is that they're a subset of the universe of products. And so in theory, the green stuff is trying to undo the negative effects that are they're continuing in the regular system. And to give you a sense on the banks, they have done tons in green bonds in the last few years. They've done more in fossil fuels. They just don't. Their marketing will not clarify that distinction, I suspect, but they're sort of playing both sides, right? It's a little like an arms dealer. The arms race is great if you could sell on both ends. The challenge that you start to have is that, number one, you have a set of products that are small and are drop in the bucket. Number two, the bigger problem is that most of them actually don't they don't have any impact, right? There's an idea of additionality, is that if I invest in this product, like this intervention, I buy this fund, something should happen in the world that's positive that would have not otherwise happened if I hadn't bought it, right? Because I'm paying more in fees or whatever. And in reality, the vast majority of what are being called impact products out there, they're usually public markets products where they're just taking publicly traded shares and they're just moving them around. And in the end, you don't create any impact out of that because, who cares if, BP shares that have been traded for decades, I decide not to own them, or I have an ETF that owns a little bit less of them. They're all based on a flawed thesis of divestment, as you referenced, screening, right? And I think somewhere along the way, people lost the plot on that because think of screening as, an investor in the Middle East decides they don't want to own alcohol companies, Diageo, because if they have some values that contravene that, and they say, well, we don't want to touch it. None of them think that they're stopping people from drinking, wine in France or California, right? They know very well that they're not partaking in it, but it's not a mechanism to stop it from happening. But somehow there's been a set of approaches that are unfortunately a big waste of time, really, just in the climate fight, where we're saying, oh, we'll divest of fossil fuel players, as if that actually reduces carbon emissions. It doesn't. It's just, you sell the share and someone else buys them and the world continues.
I think to your point is really what we're talking about is the reallocation of resources that isn't just simply, putting money from the left pocket to the right pocket, but rather really transformational aspects where we're basically saying we're going to create new industries, which is really, it's essentially, fresh capital injection into emerging industries, whether it's burning, let's say, for example, certain landfill and converting into various forms of, cleaner or various colors of hydrogen, for example, or things that's going to be really providing the infrastructure for electrification, not both from replacing the current energy consumption, but the enhanced energy consumption because of the electrification itself, to really fundamentally changing the behavior and the consumerism, which is starting to happen, but really needs to get accelerated. And I think, if you look at Europe, I think Europe has done a pretty good job when it comes to not just setting policies around what you can't do, but also allocating, budget and capital to new industries that's going to take over some of these more dinosaur legacy industries that have, really taken advantage of the environment and us at the expense of short-term profit.
You may also like our quarterly Ask Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit astroperkins.com/events.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, I think what's interesting about actually what you just said is that there's almost a game plan for that's being created for us through COVID, right? So if you think about it, COVID-19 was a challenge where science told us we needed to flatten the systemic curve, right? We all contribute to it. We all obviously bear the consequences, and it's society-wide, systemic, and we need to flatten the curve of infections. And so we did that by using government action to close places, schools, bars, make masks mandatory. And then while the government held down, infections with one hand, with the other hand, they did exactly what you've just referenced in terms of not just saying, hey, here's what you can't do. It's saying, here's what we need done. We need vaccines, right? We need emergency approval processes, direct public funding to companies to make sure they're doing R&D, and pre-orders for amounts far exceeding the US population as a part of Operation Warp Speed to make sure that all of the drug makers were doing it because we needed a solution quick. And I think for climate change, what is it? It's a systemic crisis that science tells us we need to flatten the curve, right? We need to flatten the greenhouse gas emissions curve. And I think that there's an opportunity for government to do both things again, right? You flatten the curve with one hand, price on carbon, vehicle emissions limits, energy efficiency standards, right? Those then sort of change the structure and they disincentivize the behavior we want less of. And then you have, with the other hand, again, could maybe not Operation Warp Speed. I'm a Star Trek fan. Maybe Operation New Frontiers or something along those lines where you say, okay, we need to invest now in carbon capture and storage and really all the areas you mentioned because we need to accelerate those quickly. And I think that can happen. But I think fundamentally the biggest challenge is, does that happen magically without us doing anything? Or does it require government action to step in and say, we need to adjust the incentives of the system? My view is that we need government action because I sat at the middle of the biggest machine passing money through capitalism. And I looked and I very clearly realized that there's a myth that being, responsible or good company is necessarily profitable. Unfortunately, that does work in some areas, but it doesn't work in the whole set of areas that we need it to work in. And unless government comes in and starts actually setting up incentives correctly, you don't tend not to see anything happen.
Yeah. So really great points. I absolutely agree. I think this notion of top-down approach is necessary in many cases. And again, I think I'm a neoclassical, so I'm not going to be completely for full intervention, but the role of government is absolutely there. But there's also this need for bottom-up. And to that point, Rumie actually has a role in that because it's actually educating the youth and preparing them for the future generation. Now, just to kind of set up a little bit in terms of, if you could tell us a little bit about Rumie, and it's quite interesting because during COVID, a lot of K through 12 students have had to go to essentially full e-learning. So I wonder how that's been instrumental for your organization, and what exactly is Rumie trying to do in terms of delivering low-cost technology that enables distribution of digital learning across different communities?
Our mission has always been from the beginning. We started in 2013 to make learning easy, fun, and accessible. In the early days, we worked around the world and bringing free digital learning revolution to the offline world, to places where it had the most impact because, generally the people who have the most to gain from the free digital learning revolution are the least likely to access it, right? They're in places where they don't really get access and they're the ones where, the greatest gap between realized and actual potential. And so, as we evolved it over time, we started to look into and what we're doing now, which is microlearning. And microlearning is the idea that you can learn in 5 or 6 minute snippets, and ideally really mobile first. So it's quick and convenient. And what we're finding is that the research shows that you have learner retention gains of 22%, just by parceling it out. But the far more interesting thing is that actually people just use it more, because what we're finding now is that as we launched it in the pandemic and we started to grow it, we're finding this massive acceleration. We went from 0 to over 100,000 learners, and then suddenly it's starting to peak as it grows organically. And it was all driven by a community of content creators that were growing. So it looks a bit like Wikipedia, which is one reason we're a nonprofit, is because we can leverage, volunteerism. And I saw that an amazing statistic I saw was that when we're surveying youth, 88% of them said that it actually replaces social media time. So that's an interesting thing. If you do 5 or 6 minutes on your mobile phone, you're actually not competing with Coursera or Khan Academy or some other learning alternative. That interaction is competing with Instagram, right? Because the average session time on Instagram is 6 minutes. You can get a dopamine rush for loading Instagram, right? But in the aggregate, that's going to harm your mental health over months and years. Or, as we say, hey, look, you can come and consume a micro course, which we call a bite. It's all open and free. And actually you get a dopamine rush from learning a new skill or concept also. And then, over time, that ends up benefiting you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys are definitely borrowing a lot of the gaming mechanics from the likes of Quizlet, right? So really these companies that have figured out that when you're preparing for tests, SAT, ACT, some professional sort of certification, these small snippets that you can do in between things, commutes, downtime, it really provides a micro learning that you were talking about. Part of the issue with the pandemic e-learning has been fatigue. The fact that the K through 12 general curriculum in the U.S. is already fairly archaic, but on top of that, now it's stretched over many hours, especially for really young kids, and they just don't have the cognitive patience or the load to actually absorb and retain that information. So fragmented small bites make sense, but how do you actually systematically take that into course coverage to make sure that in a certain duration that certain milestones and things are being achieved?
Yeah, how do you kind of build it all together in a chain? That's the interesting piece, is that the way we do it is that right now it's all personalized. We just use the aggregate data to look and say, well, if you've completed this bite in 5 minutes, then you would find this one interesting, this one interesting. And so it keeps people engaged. And I think in some sense, our biggest focus has been for the last few years on engagement, because we realized that's what was missing. Like in some sense, the education space has always had, the equation was quality equals impact, right? And high quality learning program is going to create impact, which is true if you're in a classroom and you have a captive audience and they're there for a 1 hour lecture. And if, 7 minutes into the lecture, they think it's boring, they can't really just leave. Right. And what we had realized is if you're obviously on someone's device, if you're 7 minutes into a 60-minute lecture and it's boring, the kid presses a button and switches to TikTok. And so what we've seen in the last year and a bit was that, and part of the reason I think that we've been successful in growing it was because we had always thought about engagement, and we're competing with social media. So people, it's not just that they need it, it's that they also want it, right? It's the overlap in the Venn diagram. A lot of traditional learning, this has led to the fatigue that you referenced, is not really engaging at all. They just took a bunch of stuff that needs to be in the classroom and they plopped it online. And, from personal experience, when I've done stuff like that, like it just burns me out. It's not interesting. It's not engaging. It's not a version of it that at least is in person that I enjoy. It's a hacked together and, sort of poor digitized version of it. And it's not interesting to a lot of learners, and it doesn't keep them engaged.
Yeah. So when I think about, the offline model of K through 12, it's this notion that everyone is treated equally by being treated unequally, in the sense of, regardless of their aptitude, ability to learn, and motivation, you put them into a physical classroom and they're forced to do essentially repetitive worksheets, right? But some percentage of those kids on the bell curve really already got most of that concept in the first 10% of the curriculum time. Whereas the other spectrum of the standard 3 deviation away, let's say, really haven't mastered even 1% of that. But everyone is being treated equally, but effectively being treated unequally in that sense. What you're talking about is this notion of mass customization. mass personalization. Really, that's the key term with gaming mechanics. That so instead of trying to force people to go through certain repetitive motion, if they mastered it and have show clear pattern of mastery, they can move on to other concepts that they're having difficulties with, which to me is highly efficient, and of course means that you get to focus on the areas that you need the most attention versus getting muddled with everything else. So that's terrific. But the challenge, of course, is whenever you're bucking the institution, how do you kind of coexist? So slightly off topic a little bit is during the pandemic, it was quite interesting, pre-pandemic as well. A lot of the teachers started to use Khan Academy as almost the primary teaching tool, which is quite interesting because it took some time, many years before they've even embraced Khan Academy. So how do you foresee Rumie getting integrated into the core educational system?
Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Damian Vaughn, former NFL player, Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank, and many more. To register, visit astroperkins.com and click on Events.
It's interesting. It's an interesting question precisely because I don't know that we necessarily need to. I think actually I would prefer in some ways that we don't, which is not to say that we don't work with schools, in which we do. We work with ministries, but it's that we don't necessarily need to do what's in their curriculum. Because what we've found is that over the early years, we were working around the world and we were doing stuff that was K-12, and then we were doing stuff that wasn't. And it was just dependent on partners we were working with around the world and what the program was, and the curriculum obviously varies in places. And what we found was that in general, and this is heavily the case in North America, is that the curriculum moves very slowly, right? It's subject to, it's political, it's a whole bunch of things, but ask anyone who's been asking for decades, like, why don't we teach more in coding or this or that in schools? Even today, most schools don't teach financial literacy. I find that ludicrous, given that, for many people, that's the only education they're going to get. And the most important decisions they'll make in their lives financially will be, mortgage and credit cards, and they don't know how they work. And so what we started to do is, because we've always had a learner-centric model, not just learner-centric in terms of the speed, as you referenced, in terms of what people learn and so on, which is enabled by technology, but also philosophically a learner-centric model, and being, a lot of NGOs are donor-driven. We're not, we're demand-driven. And so we listen to communities, and generally led to a place where we now focus on content that is job, life, and career skills oriented. It's all the things people are asking for that are outside of the K-12 curriculum, because that's actually where the greatest need has been. And it's been moving very slowly. And fascinatingly, to answer your question, it puts us in a position where we don't necessarily have to be in the classroom. We've gotten a lot of this, the learners actually want it. So a lot of services saying we want this as a part of our classroom. But, in terms of growing our impact, it's one of those things that's quite challenging, right? Because you can grow to people who decide they want to use it, which is what we're doing now. And that, you can go from 0 to 50 million people, and however long that takes. But, as soon as you go through the classroom, you go through a set of institutional mechanisms and bureaucratic structures that are quite difficult sometimes to navigate on the timeline that people need it. And so, it's a little bit of push or pull, but I think we view ourselves as arguably being really supplemental to everything that they'll learn in the classroom.
So I think the last 10 years, I think there's been a fairly robust sort of innovation happening in edtech as it pertains to the premium market around test prep. Like I mentioned before, SAT, ACT, FINRA, certifications and the various tests, for example. So can you just clarify to see if you guys are focusing more on the test prep side of the market, or really still focusing on kind of the core potential curriculum, let's say, for example, geometry, algebra, calculus, and so forth?
So, in a sense, we're working on the stuff outside of that. So I'd say like the most like categories that you'd see on Rumie Learn, it's just rumie.org, would be financial literacy, I've already referenced, mental health, job skills, life skills. There'll be areas that will, actually there's a whole bunch of sections on how to get a job, right? Like, how do you do interview questions? How do you build your CV? How do you figure out even what you want to do? Because if you think of career and skills training and retooling, people look at it as if it's just kind of like, you want to go and do a 6 to 8 month course to become a this or that. The truth is, for most of the actual people doing it in youth, they don't know where to start. And the place they want to start is not, the 6 month, the in-depth thing. It's almost like a funnel, right? So they want to first get an idea of what they want. And so with 5-minute micro courses, we can say, like, we have ones now. It's like, do I want to be, a mechanic? Do I want to be an arborist? Do I want a whole bunch of things that people wouldn't necessarily know much about, but a quick micro course and they learn, oh, okay, maybe I want to, maybe I don't. And what then happens over time is they start to get more and more in depth where they can learn the skills that they need. But it is, but it wouldn't be math and algebra in those areas, just because, the way we look at it, those are already being covered for people. Those are not the areas kind of learners have told us that they need and want and aren't getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it definitely falls within social inclusion, where certain, let's say, marginalized segments of the population, because maybe their parents or they don't have parents or fragmented nucleus family, don't have these basic things. I remember, for example, I was in foster kid and a foster system, and I didn't have a clue as to how to apply for college, for instance, and I just needed like the basic. So it's almost like taking what the Gen Zs and the millennials have been doing around how-to websites to put into these micro courses in many ways that really teaches them the basics, but allows for them to participate in the economy so they're not left behind. So it has a policy implications. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. With your personal story, in a sense of like, you didn't necessarily get the know-how, right? It's mine's not the same, but I think of like, I grew up in the suburb of Toronto, mainly immigrants and minorities. My parents were born and raised in Kenya. My brother was born in Kenya. I was the only member of my family was born here in Canada. And I didn't have the know-how, right? The soft skills, it's the sort of things that you don't get through the core curriculum. Like, you learn the stuff, but then it's like, how do you get a job? And like, there's a lot of soft skill stuff that get transferred through communities that are affluent, through families, through social networks, through other things that, it sounds like you wouldn't have had easily come to you. I had noticed also that it wasn't as easy. I had to go, really work to find it. And those are the kinds of things that I don't think are covered. And, where, a lot of the underserved communities, even if you give them the core curriculum, they need those other pieces to actually make a livelihood out of it.
I really like this a lot. I'm really resonating with this quite a bit. For those that are interested, how can they learn more? And what are the ways that public and private entities can get involved?
Well, so I think that, anyone who wants to go and try it out now can try, Rumie.org, and just go there on your phone or whatever. And what I actually do, I actually put I bookmark it and throw it, next to my social media apps, so that whenever I have 5 minutes and I feel that dopamine addiction coming, I have it right there. And instead, half the time I'll end up learning a quick micro course instead of that Instagram hit, which I'm convinced will be better for me over time. But I think, so that's one, is people can just try it. I think for companies, one of the things that we've done is, because our engine of content creation is driven by volunteers working remotely, and then we, of course, vet the content. We've had a number of companies doing volunteer activities where they actually the employees do skills-based volunteering, and they create content aligned to their core, areas of expertise. And the survey is showing it's great for the employees, because it's like it instills purpose, and they feel great about it because they're giving back. And so they're a giver of knowledge digitally, and then the receiver of it, the learners receive a ton of value. And so there's a bunch of different ways to interact. I'd say the other thing is, frankly, that people just follow us on social, right? It's Rumie Learn, or my nick is So Fancy. And one of the things we'll be doing soon more of is starting to share micro courses around how the economic system works. This kind of brings it all back together at the beginning of our conversation, is that, to drive real change on sustainability issues, we're going to need to do a lot more than we're doing now, would be my observation from, being a finance person who's in the middle of the machine. And I think helping people understand how that happens is a question of education and empowerment. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to start doing a lot more of that, because the audience that really loves microlearning tend to be younger. The audience of people who care about climate change and want to, and inequality, and want to make changes and need to understand how they do that within the system, are also younger. And so that ties together really well. And we really want to give people the tools to improve their lives and improve society.
All right. So we've been joined by Tariq Fancy, CEO of Rumie Initiative. Thank you for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.